In this video, we are going to talk about different types of assessment. But before we do that, let's talk about reasons why we assess our students. In other words, what does assessment do for us? One reason for assessment, and probably the most obvious, is to demonstrate what students have learned. After all, it's not possible to just open up their brains and directly measure what they know. Another reason for assessment is to demonstrate how well we as instructors have instructed. We need to know if what we are doing is working for our students or whether we need to be doing something different or to try a different approach. The process of assessment can actually help students learn. It can be a learning experience in of itself. We can design assignments to involve a learning component, and research actually shows that by students simply recalling information, they strengthen their learning. There is something referred to as the testing effect, and it shows that when students are tested or test themselves on some material, that they actually learn the material better. Assessment can help students apply what they have learned. This goes along the same lines as assessment helping students learn. Assessment often gives students a chance to put that learning into action, to actually use it. Assessment allows us to check in with our students to make sure that they are following along. In this case, we want to be assessing while learning is taking place because it gives us a chance to make adjustments and to tie up loose ends in understanding. And finally, and unfortunately sometimes, assessment can serve to encourage students to learn. If students know that they are going to be assessed on something, that is often one of the biggest motivators to learn. And that's okay. Students are almost always very busy with competing demands for their time. Assessment is one way that we can make sure that they are spending the time needed to learn in our class. And assessment also lets students know what it is that is most important for them to learn in our class. So, with all of these different reasons and uses for assessment, we are naturally going to need to have different forms of assessment. So in the rest of this video, we are going to talk about two broad categories of assessment, referred to as summative assessment and formative assessment. Have you heard of these two terms before? If not, stop for a moment and see if you can guess how they differ from each other. The little graphics next to each should give you some clues. Okay, so the primary purpose of summative assessment is to document level of achievement reached by a student. This is often for external audiences, where learning is evaluated against some standard or benchmark, so as to be compared with others. Summative assessment usually occurs after learning has occurred. Students learn, and then they are assessed in order to document how well they have learned. Some examples of summative assessment: midterms, finals, even quizzes if the purpose of the quizzes is to demonstrate what students have already learned. End of semester projects, presentations, portfolios which display student work, either writing portfolios of pieces that students have written or learning portfolios containing any sort of artifact or assignment students have produced in a class, or anything that represents what a student has learned in that class. So again, summative assessment is really anything that is intended to document learning after it has taken place. And then we have formative assessment. There are two primary purposes of formative assessment: to learn by doing and to provide and receive feedback on learning. So while summative assessment evaluates learning, formative assessment monitors and facilitates learning. Formative assessments are sometimes referred to as dipsticks, like checking oil in a car. They help instructors recognize where students are struggling so that instructors can then address problems immediately and target their instruction more effectively. Formative assessments also help students identify their own strengths and weaknesses and target areas that need work. So, as may be painfully obvious at this point, formative assessment takes place while learning is taking place because the purpose is to facilitate that very learning. Examples of formative assessment: class discussions and questioning, when instructors ask students to answer questions to check in and see how well students respond. Formative assessments can also take the form of admit slips, those tickets to class, or exit slips, which could involve students summarizing readings or lectures or activities that occurred that day, answering a couple of questions related to what's being learned. Students could also complete learning or reflection logs or journals that the instructor looks through regularly so as to monitor the learning process. Peer and or self-assessment is a great way of checking in on learning and getting feedback, and to facilitate learning. Debate is a great formative assessment activity that also greatly facilitates learning in the process. Think, pair, share, or like the exit slip, a summary paper can serve as a formative assessment. And even regular quizzes, because of the testing effect, can be considered formative assessment. And if quizzes are in fact regular and timely, they serve to provide feedback to the instructor on how students are learning and feedback to the students on how well they are following along. So, really, any assessment that intends to facilitate learning rather than to simply document it without changing anything is considered formative assessment. So, there you have it, summative assessment and formative assessment. And one more distinction between formative and summative assessment I wanted to mention. While summative assessment typically involves high stakes assignments that are worth a good chunk of a student's grade, formative assessments are generally low stakes, meaning that they are worth little or maybe even none of a student's grade. And this makes sense considering that a student's grade often intends to show what a student has learned after learning has taken place. Frequently, instructors will simply grade for participation in formative assessments, since the focus of formative assessment isn't to give students credit for where they are at in their learning, but rather to facilitate that learning.